Can you guys hear me now? Sorry about that. A little rough start. Not been feeling great today, so please forgive me for any scuff. But yeah, tonight we're gonna be talking a little bit about the Witch of November, which is a weather formation that happens off of the Great Lakes, and one of the most famous wrecks that it was involved with, the Edmund Fitzgerald. I'm not gonna risk offending the YouTube overlords by trying to play the actual song. But yeah. Let's get started, shall we? Yes, we don't want to upset YouTube's lawyers with copyright. So the November gale, also known as the Witch of November, as I said, refers to strong winds that blow across the Great Lakes in autumn. They're caused by intense low atmospheric pressure over the Great Lakes, pulling in cold Canadian/Arctic air and having that collide with the warm air coming from the Gulf. When these two different forces hit, they can result in hurricane force winds. As I mentioned earlier, or attempted to, the Edmund Fitzgerald is one of the most famous wrecks caused by the Witch of November. The Edmund Fitzgerald was subjected to 978 millibars of pressure, which is equivalent to, or borderline, a Category half hurricane. Which might not sound like a lot, but if anybody's been in the path of a hurricane, you'd know that that is still a lot of pressure and a lot of wind. So November gale is the formally accepted name of the weather phenomenon. The Witch of November and its variation are historical, maritime, and meteorological slang. Derivative names include witch storm, November witch, and witch gale. November is known in the Great Lakes region as the month of storms, to let you know how bad these can get. These storms are described as wailing and brewing. And a textbook from 1998 said that so many ships lay buried beneath the waters of the lakes is not so much as a mythological mystery, as a combination of circumstances, both economic and meteorologic. I'm gonna stumble on that word a lot tonight, I can tell. So, as I said before, the Fitzgerald is not the only, it's just one of the most famous wrecks that were caused by a witch. Though it is probably the most recent, according to this page, as the Edmund Fitzgerald sank 50 years ago. On November 10th, 1975. Before that, there was the Great Lakes Storm of 1913, which is also referred to as the Big Blow. Chappy nice. The Freshwater Fury, and the White Hurricane. It was a blizzard with hurricane force winds that devastated the Great Lakes Basin in the Midwestern United States and southwestern Ontario, Canada, from November 7th to the 10th. The storm was most powerful on November 9th, battering and overturning 4 of the 5 Great Lakes, specifically Lake Huron. And then one of the last famous storms was the Mataafa. Again, apologies if I pronounced that wrong. Storm of 1905, which occurred again in November from the 27th to the 28th of 1905. It's named after the steamship Mataafa that it ended up destroying, and it also destroyed or damaged about 29 vessels, killing the 36 seamen and causing shipping losses of up to $3.567 million. These are 1905 dollars. So I don't know what the cost for inflation today is, but I'm sure it's a ton. And because of how influential this time of the year and these storms are to that part of the country, the Lake Superior Maritime Visitor Center holds a benefit festival each year. I figured we start with the big one and work our way back in history. So the SS Edmund Fitzgerald was an American Great Lakes freighter. It lost the entirety of its crew of 29 men. When it launched in June 7th of 1958, she was the largest ship on the Great Lakes and remains the largest to have sunk there. For 17 years, the Edmund Fitzgerald carried a variety of iron ore from mines along Minnesota to the ironworks in Detroit, Toledo, and other Great Lake ports. As a workhorse, she set seasonal haul records 6 times, often breaking her own record. Captain Peter Pulser was known for piping music day or night over the ship's intercom while passing through the St. Clair and Detroit rivers between Lake Huron and Lake Erie, and entertaining spectators at the Sioux Locks between Lakes Superior and Huron. Which gave the captain the nickname of the DJ Captain by boat watchers. She sunk carrying a full cargo of ore pellets with her captain, Ernest M. McSorley, in command. That voyage was from Superior, Wisconsin, near Duluth, and it was set on the afternoon of November 9th, 1975. While en route, she joined up with another freighter, the SS Arthur M. Anderson. By the next day, the two ships were caught in a severe storm on Lake Superior, with near hurricane force winds and up to 35-foot high waves. She was sunk shortly after 7:10 p.m. About 17 miles from Whitefish Bay, near the twin cities of Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. The distance she could have covered in just over an hour at the top speed of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The Edmund Fitzgerald previously reported being in significant difficulty to the Swedish vessel Avafors, noting that she had a bad list and had lost both radars, and she was taking heavy seas over the deck. However, despite this, no distress signals were ever sent before she sank. Her last message by Captain McSorley was to the Arthur M. Anderson that they were holding their own. Her crew of 29 perished and no bodies were recovered. The exact cause of the sinking remains a mystery, though some deem that it might have been swamped, suffered structural failure, or top-sized, grounded on shoal, or a combination of all those. Ernest M. McSorley was the last captain of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, perishing along with other 28 members of his crew on November 10th, 1975. She was en route to the steel mill on Zug Island near Detroit, Michigan, with a cargo of over 26,000 tons of tectonic ore pellets. It soon reached her full speed of 16.3 miles per hour. It was around 5 p.m. when the Edmund Fitzgerald joined the second freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, under the command of Captain Jesse B. Barney Cooper, who was destined for Gary, Indiana, out of Two Harbors, Minnesota. The weather forecast was not unusual for November, and the National Weather Service predicted that the storm would pass just south of Lake Superior by 7 a.m. on the 10th. I'm not sure. It's taconite or pellets. Oh. Ha ha. Very funny. Ah. No, Detroit. Nobody wants to go there. I kid. The SS Wilfred Sykes loaded opposite of the Edmund Fitzgerald at the Burlington Northern Dock and departed around 4:15 p.m., about 2 hours after the Edmund Fitzgerald. Captain Dudley, however, predicted that the storm would cross directly over Lake Superior. So he chose a route that took advantage of the protection offered by the lake's north shore to avoid the worst effects of the storm. The crew of the Wilfred Sykes followed the radio conversations between the Edmund Fitzgerald and Arthur M. Anderson during the first part of their trip, and overheard their captains deciding to take the regular Lakes Carrier Association downbound route. The weather forecast was altered at 7 p.m., issuing gale warnings for the whole of Lake Superior. The Arthur M. Anderson and Edmund Fitzgerald altered their course northward, seeking shelter along the Ontario shore, where they encountered a winter storm at 1 a.m. The Edmund Fitzgerald reported winds of 52 knots, or 60 miles per hour, and waves 10 feet high. Captain Piquet of the Wilfred Sykes reported that after 1 a.m. he overheard McSorley say that he had reduced the ship's speed because of the rough conditions. Piquet said he was stunned to hear later that, as McSorley was not known for turning aside or slowing down. Stating that they were going to try for some lee from Isle Royale. At 2 a.m., the forecast was upgraded from gale to storm, forecasting winds of 35 to 50 knots, 40 to 58 miles per hour. Until then, the Edmund Fitzgerald had followed the Arthur M. Anderson at a constant 14.6 miles an hour. But the faster Edmund Fitzgerald had pulled ahead at around 3 a.m. As the storm center passed over the ships, they experienced shifting winds, with speeds temporarily dropping as wind direction changed from northeast to south and then northwest. After 1:50 p.m., the M. Arthur Anderson logged winds of 50 knots, or 58 miles per hour. Wind speeds picked up again rapidly, and it began to snow around 2:45 p.m., reducing visibility. It was at that point that the Arthur M. Anderson lost sight of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which was about 16 miles ahead at the time. Shortly after 3 p.m., Captain McSorley radioed Arthur M. Anderson to report that the Edmund Fitzgerald was taking on water and had lost 2 vent covers and fence railing, and that the vessel had developed a list, which is like a tilt. Two of the Edmund Fitzgerald's 6 bilge pumps ran continuously to discharge shipped water. McSorley said he would slow his ship down so that the Arthur M. Anderson could close the gap between them. In a broadcast shortly after, the United States Coast Guard warned all shipping that the Sioux locks had been closed and they should seek safe anchorage. Shortly after 4:10 p.m., McSorley called the Arthur M. Anderson again to report a radar failure and asked the Arthur M. Anderson to keep track of them. Edmund Fitzgerald, effectively blind, slowed to let Arthur M. Anderson come within a 10-mile range so she could receive radar guidance from the other ship. For the time, Arthur M. Anderson directed the Edmund Fitzgerald towards the safety of Whitefish Bay. At 4:39 p.m., McSorley contacted the United States Coast Guard station in Grand Marais, Michigan, to inquire whether the Whitefish Point light and navigation beacon were operational. They replied that their monitoring equipment indicated that both instruments were inactive. McSorley then hailed any ships in the Whitefish Point area to report the state of navigational aid, receiving an answer from Captain Cedric Woodard of the Alpha Force between 5 and 5:30 p.m. that the Whitefish Point light was on, but not the radio beacon. Woodard testified to the Marine Board that he overheard McSorley say, "Don't allow it, nobody on deck," as well as something about an event that Woodard could not understand. By late in the afternoon of November 10th, sustained winds of over 50 knots, or 58 miles per hour, were recorded by ships and observation points across eastern Lake Superior. The Arthur M. Anderson logged sustained winds as high as 58 knots, or 67 miles per hour, at 4:52 p.m., while waves increased as high as 25 feet by 6 p.m. The Arthur M. Anderson was also struck by 70 to 75 knot, or 81 to 86 mile per hour gusts, and rogue waves as high as 35 feet. At approximately 7:10 p.m., when the Arthur M. Anderson notified Edmund Fitzgerald of an upbound ship and asked how she was doing, McSorley reported, "We are holding our own." She was never heard from again. No distress signal was received, and 10 minutes later, the Arthur M. Anderson lost the ability to reach the Edmund Fitzgerald either by radio or by radar. Captain Cooper of the Arthur M. Anderson called the United States Coast Guard at 7:39 p.m. on Channel 16, the radio distress frequency. The responders instructed him to call back on Channel 12 because they wanted to keep their emergency channel open and were having difficulty with their communication systems. Cooper then contacted the upbound saltwater vessel, Nanfree, and was told that she could not pick up the Edmund Fitzgerald on her radar either. Despite repeated attempts to raise the United States Coast Guard, Cooper was not successful until 7:45 p.m. when the officer on duty asked him to keep watch for a 16-foot boat lost in the area. At about 8:25 p.m., Cooper again called the Coast Guard to express concern about the Edmund Fitzgerald, and at 9:03 reported her missing. Petty Officer Philip Branch later testified that he considered it serious, but at the time, not urgent. Like an appropriate search and rescue vessels to respond to the disaster, at approximately 9 p.m., the Coast Guard asked the Arthur M. Anderson to turn around and look for survivors. At around 10:30, the Coast Guard asked all commercial vessels anchored in or near Whitefish Bay to assist in the search. The initial search for survivors was carried out by the Arthur M. Anderson and a second freighter, the SS William Clay Ford. The efforts of a third freighter, the Toronto-registered SS Hilda Marjane, were foiled by the weather. The Coast Guard sent a buoy tender, Wood Rush, from Duluth, but it took 2.5 hours to launch and a day to travel the search area. The Traverse City Coast Guard station launched an HU-16 fixed-wing search aircraft that arrived on the scene at 10:53 p.m., while an HH-52 Coast Guard helicopter with a 3.8 million candle power searchlight arrived at 1 a.m. on November 11th. Canadian Coast Guard aircraft joined the 3-day search, and the Ontario Provincial Police established and maintained a beach patrol along the eastern shore of Lake Superior. Although the search recovered debris, including lifeboats and rafts, none of the crew were found. On her final voyage, the Edmund Fitzgerald's crew consisted of 29. The captain, the first, second, and third mates, 5 engineers, 3 oilers, a cook, a wiper, 2 maintenance men, 3 watchmen, 3 deckhand, 3 wheelsmen, 2 porters, a cadet, and a steward. Most of the crew were from Ohio and Wisconsin. Ages ranged from 20 to 63. When the Edmund Fitzgerald sank, Whitefish Point area had claimed at least 240 ships. The wreck was found by a U.S. Navy Lockheed P-30 Orion aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant George Connor, using its magnetic anomaly detector on November 14th, 1975. The Edmund Fitzgerald lies about 15 miles west of Dead Man's Cove, Ontario, about 8 miles northwest of Pancake Bay Provincial Park, and about 17 miles from the entrance to Whitefish Bay to the southeast. So it looks like she split in half when she sunk. From May 20th to the 28th, 1976, the U.S. Navy dived on the wreck of the using its unmanned submersible, and found the Edmund Fitzgerald laying in two large pieces. The bow section stood upright in the mud, some 170 feet from the stern section, which lay capsized at a 50-degree angle from the bow. Between the two sections lay a mass of the pellets and scattered wreckage, including hatch covers and hull plating. In 1980, during a Lake Superior research dive expedition, marine explorer Jean-Michel Cousteau, son of Jacques Cousteau, sent two divers in the first manned submersible dive to the Edmund Fitzgerald. The dive was brief, and though the team drew no final conclusions, they speculated that the Fitzgerald had broken up upon the surface. We've already talked about these different things. Now here are some of the memorials. This is the bell. The day after the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the Mariners' Church in Detroit rang its bell 29 times, once for each life lost. The church continued to hold an annual memorial reading the names of the crewmen and ringing the church bell until 2006, when the church broadened its memorial to commemorate all lives lost on the Great Lakes. After the death of the singer Gordon Lightfoot, who popularized the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the church bell was ceremonially rung 29 times in memory of the crew. plus an additional ring in memory of Lightfoot, who committed their deaths to posterity. The ship's bell was recovered from the wreck on July 4th, 1995. A replica engraved with the names of the 29 sailors who had died replaced the original on the wreck. A legal document signed by 46 relatives of the deceased, officials of the Mariners Church of Detroit, and the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historic Society donated the custodian and conservation ship of the bell to the GLSHS to be incorporated in a permanent memorial at Whitefish Point to honor the memory of the 29 men of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The terms of the legal agreement made the GLSHS responsible for maintaining the bell and forbade it from selling or moving the bell or using it for commercial purposes. An anchor from the Edmund Fitzgerald, lost on an earlier trip from 1974, was recovered from the Detroit River on July 20th of 1992. It is on display at the Dozen Great Lakes Museum in Detroit. The Dozen Great Lakes Museum also hosts a Lost Mariners Remembrance event each year on the evening of November 10th. Artifacts on display in the Steamship Valley Camp Museum in Salt Lake include 2 lifeboats, photos, and a movie of the Edmund Fitzgerald, along with commemorative models and paintings. Every November 10th, the Split Rock Lighthouse near Silver Bay, Minnesota, emits a light in honor of the Edmund Fitzgerald. So, moving on from the Edmund Fitzgerald, let's talk about the Great Lakes Storm of 1913. Also known as the Freshwater Fury and the Light Hurricane, which was a blizzard with hurricane force winds that devastated the Great Lakes Basin in the Midwestern United States and southwestern Ontario between November 7th and 10th, 1913. At the time of the storm, the United States Weather Bureau did not have enough data, communications, analysis capability, and understanding of atmospheric dynamics to predict or understand the storm. They were also unable to predict wind directions to allow ships to avoid or cope with the storm's conditions. More modern studies of the available information and data from the storm provide better descriptions of its weather mechanisms and treat it as 2 storms. By November 7th, a string of low-pressure centers in Canada had consolidated into a low-pressure center southwest of Lake Superior, which became Storm Number 1. At the same time, warm air pushed into the central Great Lakes from the south. By the 8th, this storm was moving east through northern Lake Huron, while strong northerly winds developed behind it over Lake Superior. By the 9th, Storm 2 had formed over the Carolinas and Virginia. The northern portion of this storm began sweeping moist, warm air from the Atlantic over colder air in the Ohio area, producing heavy snows. The northwest portion of this extremely powerful storm began creating strong winds from the north along the axis of Lake Huron, building large waves. By the 10th, 24 hours of such building had created immense waves, which ships were subjected to, along with the high winds, as the center of the storm crossed north-northwest over Lake Erie, near Toronto. Pressures went as low as 968.5 millibars. Winds exceeding hurricane force occurred over 4 of the Great Lakes for extended periods. Wave heights observed during the storm were estimated by observation rather than measurements. Observations exceeding 35 foot were corroborated by modern-day simulations, which estimate these at 38 feet. The interaction between waves, such as those reflected from vertical shorelines, can nearly double wave heights. Observations of such waves during the storm estimated some as high as 50 feet, including the one that crushed the bridge of the L.C. Waldo. That would be terrifying, chat. Like, look at the guy, and then look at the size of this wave. And the reason that these storms are so dangerous and that the lakes don't give up their dead is the fact that the water of the lakes is so much colder than your standard lake. I'm not doing a great job of describing this, but anybody who is on TikTok or the internet in general knows Geo and Spooky Lake Month. I'm pretty sure she does Lake Superior every year, so go check her out. She's a lot more good at explaining all this. The storm was the deadliest, most destructive natural disaster in recorded history to hit the Great Lakes, killing more than 250 people, destroying 19 ships, and stranding 19 others. and about $1 million of U.S. cargo, including coal, iron ore, and grain, was lost. Along the shorelines, the blizzard stopped traffic and communication, causing hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage. Cleveland had received 22 inches of heavy snow, combined with sustained winds of 62 miles per hour, with gusts up to 79 miles per hour, and ice. There were 4-foot tall snowdrifts around Lake Huron, and electricity was disrupted for several days across Michigan and Ontario, cutting off telephone and then telegraph communications. Captains upon the Great Lakes reported waves reaching 35 feet in height. These waves were shorter in length than waves usually formed by the gales, and occurred in rapid succession. Rocky shores prevalent on the lakes reflect rather than absorb the waves. And these waves combine with incoming waves to create rogue waves of up to 50 feet. In the late afternoon of November 10th, an unknown vessel was spotted floating upside down in about 60 feet of water on the eastern coast of Michigan, within sight of Huronia Beach and the mouth of the St. Clair River. Determining the identity of this ship became national interest, resulting in daily front-page news covering. The ship eventually sank and was identified on the 15th as the Charles S. Price. The front page of that day's Times Herald Extra Edition read, "Boat is Price, diver is Baker, secret known." Milton Smith, an assistant engineer who decided at the last moment not to join his crew on premonition of disaster, helped identify bodies from the wreck. God, talk about a lucky break. Jesus. Among the debris cast up by the storm was the wreckage of a tugboat, the Searchlight, which was lost in April of 1907. And these are all the ships that sank during the storm. This table below does not include 3 victims from the freighter, the William Nottingham, who had volunteered to leave the ship on a lifeboat in search of assistance. Most of the bodies were recovered on the Canadian shores of southern Lake Huron. The lost ships include some of the newest and largest ships on the Great Lakes. So we have the Charles S. Price, which was the mystery ship. The Isaac M. Scott. The John A. McGean. The Argus. The Hydrus. The Henry B. Smith. The James Carruthers. the Virginia, the Wexford, and Leafield. Not pictured are the Plymouth and the LV-82 Buffalo, which was raised and later scrapped. I wonder if we can... Yeah. So that's it after it sank. And then the schooner was the Plymouth, which is like a really big sail ship. And then, because I'm not feeling too great tonight, guys, the last storm that we were going to be covering is the Mataafa storm. Or I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. It was a storm in 1905 that occurred on the Great Lakes on November 27th through the 28th of 1905. And you can see the weather map over here. The storm was named after the steamship Mataafa, which it ended up destroying. And it also destroyed or damaged 20 to 30 other vessels, killing the 36 seamen and causing shipping losses of $3 to $5 million, $1905 upon Lake Superior. A storm system moving through the Great Basin on November 26th and 27th was forecast to bring fresh easterly winds to the Great Lakes during the afternoon and evening on November 27th by the United States Weather Bureau. At 6 p.m., winds at Duluth, Minnesota, had reached 44 miles per hour. Storm flags were flying by the morning of November 28th as the cyclone moved into southern Minnesota. At the time, easterly gales and heavy snows had spread across Lake Superior, Lake Huron, and Lake Erie. 5-minute winds reaching 68 miles per hour at Duluth during the early morning of November 28th before dropping below gale force by noon. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon on November 27th, 1905, the bulk carrier SS Mataafa was on her way out of Duluth, loaded with iron ore and towing the barge James Nasmith. She was hit by the storm, and though she struggled on for a short time, by the time she reached Two Harbors, Minnesota, at 4 p.m. the next day, it was clear to her master, the Captain R.F. Humble, that she could not make that run. He gave the order to turn about and turned back towards Duluth. As the Mataafa approached port, it became clear that it was useless to try to bring both steamer and barge through the narrow Duluth Ship Canal into the harbor. So Captain Humble gave the order to cut James Nasmith loose. The Mataafa attempted to make it into a safe harbor alone. She made it about halfway between the twin concrete piers when a backwater surged out. Heavy water struck her stern, driving her prow down into the muddy bottom, and then slammed her stern against the north pier. Her rudder tore off, and the water pulled her prow out towards the open lake and smashed her stern against the south pier. She grounded in the shallow water outside of the north pier, where she broke in two, her stern settling slowly into the water. When the ship broke in two, 12 men were in the aft position. 3 of them struggled to the forward portion. The remaining 9 remained on board in the aft portion and died of exposure during the night, one of which had to be chopped out of solid ice. The 15 men in the forehalf fared better, although rescue attempts were futile during the storm. Though the next day a small boat made it out, and all 15 were taken. Some of the other wrecks from the Mataafa storm include the steamer the Isaac Elwood, the R.W. England, the Crescent City, the Lafayette, a barge of Lafayette the Manila, the steamer William Edenborn, and its barge the Madeira, the George Herbert, which was a scow, the wooden steamer, the George Spencer, and its barge, the Amboy, Monkshaven, which was a steamer, along with the William E. Corey, which was also a steamer, the Western Star, the Corail, the Maya, which was the barge of the Coralia, the Ira H. Owen, the Perry G. Walker, the Vega, and the J. H. Outhwaite. Because of the storm, the Split Rock Lighthouse was built upon Lake Superior off Silver Bay, Minnesota. The Mataafa storm also spawned the Vincent versus Erie case, which has remained a staple for first-year torts class. This case is where the defendant, Lake Erie, was at the dock of the plaintiff, Vincent, to unload cargo from the Reynolds, a steamship owned by the defendant, when the unusually violent storm developed. Lake Erie was unable to leave the dock safely, and deckhands for the steamship instead tied the Reynolds to the dock, continually changing ropes as they began to wear and break. A sudden fierce wind threw the ship against the dock, significantly damaging the dock. The issue was, should they pay for the damage? Which the Judge O'Brien decided yes, that the private necessity may require one to take or damage another's property, but compensation is required. If the Reynolds had entered the harbor at the time the storm began, and the wind knocked her against the dock, this force of nature would not have allowed Vincent to recover. The defendant, Lake Erie, deliberately kept the Reynolds tied to the dock. If they had not done so, the ship could have been lost, creating far greater damage than what was caused to the dock. Although it was the prudent thing to do, Lake Erie is still liable to Vincent for the damages. And then Judge Lewis dissented that one who constructs a dock and conducts business assumes a risk of damage that may occur from storms, and believed that Vincent had assumed risk of damage caused by Lake Erie. Oh, interesting. The ruling of Vincent versus Lake Erie assures private citizens from public policy standpoint that they will be compensated for their loss. Vincent will be compensated for repairs, and Lake Erie can rest assured that their ship will not sink. Yeah. I hope everybody doesn't mind that this is a bit of a shorter stream, but as I mentioned before, not feeling great. Actually fell earlier in the week, or last week, and still trying to heal up from that, so I'm in a bit of a pain, but healing up nicely, so nobody needs to worry about that. And I should be back to do a normal length stream on Thursday. So, until then, I hope everybody has a good rest of your night. Go listen to Lightfoot's The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, since I'm not able to play it on here. And I will see you guys on Thursday. Good night.